From the Cold Formed Steel Buildings Association, this is Cold Formed Buildings Made Easy with your hosts, John Cosper and Lauren Toole.
Hello, welcome to Cold Formed Steel Buildings Made Easy. We're your hosts, John Cosper and Lauren Toole. Today, we're going to be talking to Nathan Margosian. Nathan is the founder of Netmar Construction, based out of Colorado. He is an expert in cold formed buildings. He's pretty much built his construction company around cold formed steel. And he's part of a committee that is helping to put together the Cold Formed Steel Building Association. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Very excited to be talking with you guys and talk about cold form. It's always a fun thing to do. So, yeah.
Awesome. Give us a little bit of your background. Where did you come from before you got into steel buildings and construction?
Yeah, so before I got into steel buildings, I was actually an electrician. I was an electrician for about 3 years in Denver, and then I ended up having a short stint in Florida, and then ended up moving to Grand Junction, Colorado, which is where I still live now. And when I moved to Grand Junction, I was kind of tired of doing the electrical work. It was good for the time I spent in it. It's a good career for a lot of people. It just didn't hold a lot of interest for me anymore. So I knew I wanted to do something with either welding or framing, and I saw an ad doing steel framing, and I was like, well, that's kind of best of both worlds. So answered the ad, went in for an interview. It ended up being a cold form vendor who was trying to find more consistent subcontractors to give jobs to so that they could sell more. And because those kind of go hand in hand, right? So started working for him directly, and then worked for a different company where I was able to get on a little bit more complex jobs, doing the same thing still with cold form, and learned a lot from that individual. And then pretty quickly, I was kind of looking around at some of the other erectors, and a lot of them were kind of doing it, I don't want to say part time, but they weren't fully committed to it. And I just kind of saw a gap in my area for that industry, and I saw a lot of potential and need for the product itself. So that kind of got me excited. So then I started my own business, and yeah, got some guys to join me, started a company, and I've been doing that for 3 years. And I build steel buildings in general, so I will build red iron. Even kind of looking at some Versatube stuff, but just for really small structures, I wouldn't put it on par with cold form or red iron. We can talk about more about the differences of those things and their different utilities later on if you guys want to. But 95% of what I build has been cold form, and I don't see that changing really anytime soon, just because I think it's a good product to work with. I think it's a good thing. There's a lot of benefits, particularly for the end buyer, the actual customer. But yeah, so yeah, had the business for about 3 years now, and we're going strong. We're growing, so it's good.
Can you tell me some difference in red iron and cold form, like how it's built?
Well, there's pros and cons to everything, right? With cold form, you have to stage and cut like apex braces, knee braces, which actually Act, which is the software that we use to design them, has actually made some really cool adjustments, which we're really excited about recently, with where the haunch plates and the apex plates actually negate the need for the specific apex and knee braces, which I think is amazing for the erector and for the customer. And there's a specific reason I think that's very good for the customer. But keeping it just on the erection standpoint, cutting those things is something that if you're a red iron guy coming to cold form, it's just kind of another step that you're not really used to. Pretty much all the main framing of a red iron is all bolt together, whereas cold form used to be all screws. Now you can go either or. I typically like screws anyway. And then also with red iron buildings, the layout for the main columns, they're already wet set receiver bolts that are in the concrete. So the concrete guy or specific anchor bolt setter guy will come in and do that prior. So if it's a big if, but if those are all laid out really well, then theoretically what you can do is, as a red iron guy, you can come in, stand your columns, just drop them directly into places once you have them organized properly and fly in your rafters. And with cold form, it's very similar, but we have the after set bolts, so the concrete's just flat, there's no bolts in there, and then you have to go in, do all your layouts, drill it, and then set the bolts in yourself, which I see as a benefit because you don't have to rely on all these because that's a very important step making those your layout, your base spacings really exactly how they need to be. And if you have a concrete guy or even an anchor bolt guy, which theoretically, if they're doing the foundations for the building, they should be very familiar with the plans, but that is not always the case. I've ran into that, particularly when putting buildings on piers as well instead of full foundations or full slabs. They don't account for like dirt depths or all that affecting the spacings of the columns. And so if you have someone who doesn't really know what they're looking at and they set those bolts in the wrong places, that's a major problem. It's going to cause a lot of delays. It's going to be very expensive. It just sucks for everybody. But with cold form, as the erector, you actually have that control from start to finish. So I actually prefer it that way because I can go in, even if the pad isn't perfectly square, straight, and all that, I can square everything exactly how I want it to be. I can like mark in my base spacing is exactly where I want them to be and where I know they need to be. And I don't have to worry about the two guys previously making that decision for me. So I prefer that. Cold form is also, depending on the size, need a lot less equipment than red iron because the material itself is a lot lighter. At least in most cases, I've done some bigger buildings. I'm working on a pretty big one right now. And that one, I mean, I don't need a crane for it, but got a pretty heavy duty telehandler that I pretty much use as a crane to fly in the rafters. So that's more similar to red iron. But if you're looking for someone who's kind of doing like a DIY little shop in the backyard, that kind of thing, if you got just a couple of people, and depending on what it is, you could just do it on ladders if you really wanted to. Since I build them full time and I do a wide scope of sizes, I've got sets of equipment that I use and to make the life of my guys and myself a lot easier. But again, depending on what you're doing, it's a lot more user friendly for the DIYer opposed to red iron.
Yeah, depending on the size of the building, it could be a DIY application. I saw one that was
Yeah.
erected by a 76, 77, and 78-year-old. Just three neighbors that put it up as some simple garage.
Dang.
Yeah.
Nice.
So you talked about a couple things in there we can kind of go back and look at, but some of the savings between other building types and cold form, it comes in, the foundation's usually going to be 25%
Yeah.
less than your red iron, and then the equipment rental and everything like that. And then, you were talking about the braceless buildings that are starting to appear as well, thanks to the new innovations and stuff. But talk about how that's going to change things and make things easier.
Yeah, that's huge. And I forget the exact dimensions because it's a bit restricted. It's only kind of for the smaller ones. But again, if you're a DIYer, you're more often than not, that person is going to be doing it on the smaller side anyway. And if you're doing it professionally, you need to know how to cut the apex and the knee braces regardless, so you can do it in all sorts of applications, right? I mean, I would love to see it if if we get rid of knee and apex braces altogether on all sizes, that would be amazing. I don't know if that's possible. I'm not an engineer, but that would be really cool. But I think that's a big thing. And specifically for the end customer, not just for the DIYer, but also if you're just paying someone to build it. One of the really cool things about cold form opposed to red iron, particularly in the residential side of things, because I usually I build everything from agricultural buildings, storage units, warehouses, factories, shops, garages, barn dominiums. We do all of that. And for the barn dominiums and even some of the shops, just to save space, because red iron columns and rafters are all tapered, right? So you have this big, sometimes awkward. Sometimes people like the look of it, and in agriculture it may not matter as much and that kind of thing. But a lot of people, if you're going to finish out the inside, if you have this big tapered column in the way, that gets in the way of a lot of the future plans. And for drywalling it, encasing stuff, so a lot of people don't like that extra space that it takes up. Whereas the cold form, it's perfectly straight, so you don't have that issue. And it's like that with the rafters as well. So you can gain a lot of extra space in your walls and your roof just from that. And I guess some people don't care, but most people that I've found, that's actually it's actually been a selling point for some. And then the knee braces can negate that benefit a little bit if they're on the building now. But even if they are, they're typically so high up that it's not the same as a red iron where that taper starts from the base most of the time. Whereas if you got a knee brace and you got a 16-foot eve height and that knee brace starts at 14 feet, I mean, that might be in your attic anyway. So it's less of a factor.
For sure. Yeah. It's always fun to me when I go in different buildings, and particularly barn dominiums, you'll see this, and how each individual owner chooses what they choose to do with the apex and with the haunch. And I was in one in Missouri recently where he has actually taken wood panels and roughing them up to make it look like wood beams, in the knee
Oh,
and
nice.
apex. So it looks more of like a wood frame. And then I've seen where they'll make trims and they'll wrap them, or they'll encase them in other things, and then I've also seen them just leave them bare. So I mean, it just really kind of depends on what the look you're looking for. But yeah, the really nice thing with the new bracket system, obviously, is getting rid of that. It does sometimes cut into the space, your available space along the walls, if you have those braces, coming in. It makes it more difficult.
So, what is a typical job look like from start to finish? Just curious. Like once it gets delivered.
First thing we do is we go in, and so I usually am fairly backed up in my erection schedule. So what I like to do is the day or the day after. Sometimes they get delivered a little later in the day, right? But as soon as we can, I send out two of my guys, and I have them do an inventory check. So that's the first thing I do. We pull apart all of the steel, all the girts, all the purlins, jam, sills, rafters, columns, all that good stuff. And we make sure that everything is delivered as it should be. Most of the time, we're missing like really, really minor stuff. It's not a big thing. Every now and then, maybe like once a year, we have a bigger thing that we're missing that's maybe a little bit more important. That happens when you got building packages, especially if they're larger and more complicated buildings. It's a lot, but that's why we do the inventory checks. We've got a pretty good system that we've written up here at Netmar for how to go about doing that. That way we can get everything ordered and replaced as quickly as possible if there is something missing. And then by the time we get to the job, we can go ahead and just get right to building. A little prior to that, what I like to do is if we're designing and selling the building, someone's coming to us to design and purchase it. Once we get permits approved, that's when we place the order and get it signed off, because counties are what they say they'll have approved, and then what they actually approve sometimes depends on who's in the office. So we make sure that the permits are all signed off before we place the order, in case we do need to go back into the program, make the whatever necessary changes we need to make. And then during that time frame, we like to get the dirt work and the concrete done, so that's all ready to go, and the concrete has plenty of time to cure, particularly for the larger ones that we plan on putting equipment on. It needs a good amount of time for that to be nice and stable for us, so it doesn't shift with all the weight, more of the equipment than of the material itself. Because as you guys mentioned earlier, the cold form material is a lot lighter, which is why it doesn't need as expensive concrete foundation requirements, which is another big plus for the customer. So then by the time we get there, material's been delivered, permits are all good, we've inventory checked it, and concrete's cured, like we're ready to go. And then first thing that we do is we just go and immediately start doing layout. So we pull all our measurements for the concrete pad itself. Obviously, everything's adjusted based off of the end wall and sidewall girt depths. End walls are oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes different than the sidewalls. Sidewalls are typically the same as each other. End walls are typically the same as each other, but end wall to sidewall can be different, but not always the case. Just got to read the plans. Pretty clear. It'll tell you. It'll tell you on there. But yeah, I go off of that, and then I square everything. We have a specific way that I like pulling things to make sure that we're not getting skewed based off of the concrete. Like, for example, I'll pull everything. If we've got 6-inch end wall girts and like 4-inch sidewall girts, for example, I can go as much detail as you guys like. I can go as little as you like. So if I'm rambling too much, just stop.
I like all the details because nobody actually talks about it. So
okay. What I like to do is I like to determine where, because I know that the concrete it's never going to be absolutely perfectly straightly cut, perfectly square, those kinds of things. It's nothing against the concrete guys, but like you're having these forms in, especially on larger pads, it's a lot of concrete while it shifts, especially if you're doing it in a time where there's even a little bit of kind of temperature changes. Obviously, no one's pouring concrete in like the dead of winter, or they shouldn't be anyway. I like to make sure that my layout is going to be perfectly straight and square regardless of concrete. So I kind of pick the side of the building that has like the prevailing view. So if it's like a shop, for example, or a garage that's going to be right next to someone's house, and like their driveway's coming up to the front, I'm going to pull my measurements from the front. So again, going off of that 6-inch end wall girt depth and the 4-inch sidewall girt depth, I'm going to take my 6-inch, and then I'm going to pick specifically the corner of the front that I want to look the best based on the concrete. And I do a similar thing when I look at my sheeting layout, when I pick sheeting directions and all that. That's a little different because that also is affected by prevailing wind and potentially rain and snow. If we're at higher elevations, we're more worried about that. So let's just say we've got one corner. It's the front left corner that we want the view to look the best from, because that's like right against their driveway. That's where they're going to see when they come home every day. That's what their family's going to see first when they come to visit, all that good stuff, right? So then I'm going to go off of that corner. I'm going to pull my 6-inch for my end wall girt from the front. I'm going to pull my 4-inch from that same corner's side. And then we're just going to go with it being a 40 by 40, right? We'll just keep it small, keep it simple, right? From that same corner, I'm going to take those marks and I'm going to take 6 inches on my mark. And so not pulling from edge of concrete. So it's like that 6 inches from edge of concrete, but I'm holding the 6-inch mark of my tape measure. You want to use a metal tape measure. That's very important, particularly the larger you get, because the fabric ones can stretch. It can be minimal, but if you're especially if you're using it a lot, like if you're professional, you're doing it all the time, it will stretch out. So you want to get a metal one, and you want to hold that 6-inch right there in that corner on that line that you made. And you're going to take it all the way parallel on that side, all the way down to the other end wall. And you're not going to mark your 40 foot. You're going to see where your 40 foot mark is, and you're going to backtrack 6 inches. So you're going to hit 39 foot 6. And the reason you want to do it that way is because if your concrete is 40 foot and 1/4 inch, and you go to each end and you mark 6-inch just pulling from concrete, and you go to the other end, you mark 6-inch pulling from concrete from that side, you're 1/4 inch off, which is either going to cause you a lot of frustration when you're trying to square the building, do your other layout, or you're not going to notice it during that stage or decide it's not important. And then when you're putting in your girts, particularly if you're doing the bolted style, where those are pre-punched holes anyway, if you're doing the screws, you can kind of manipulate it a little bit, but you're just making life harder on yourself, because then you got to do more math and you got to offset everything based off of that 1/4 inch. And it could be worse. I mean, I've gone up to pads and they've been like 4 inches off, which is not fun. That only happened once, but that sucked. And then we cut concrete and we do other things, right? But if you got the bolted ones, then you have you set your columns in, and you base it off of that inaccurate overall measurement spacings. And then you have the bolts, which are going to set it to the actual accurate measurement spacings of what they're supposed to be. And now your walls kind of go like that, right? And 1/4 inch over, if it's depending on how tall the building is, like, is it really going to be that big of a deal? No, but why be off at all when you very easily can just have it perfect on layout, right? So I like doing it that way. And then likewise, if the concrete's a little too short, you can be offset the other way. So you have all those things, right? So I'll pull the 6 and the 6, or I'm sorry, the 6 and then the 39/6. And then from the 4-inch, from that same corner, switching to the sidewalls, I do the same process. So I come in 4 inches, pulling from that concrete, and then I go in and, what did we say? It was a 40 by 40. So then on that other, pulling directly parallel to that end wall going to the other side wall, you're now looking for 39 foot 8. And that's where you make your mark. And then you go off of that front wall, you go to that other corner and do the 6 and then the 39/6. And then that's important too. You want to make sure you're pulling from the same direction. So let's say we're going to pull all of our end wall layout measurements from end wall A. And then we're going to do the same from side wall A on both ends. And so then we have all of those. You extend them if you need to, just to make them like in the intersection, right? And then you take that same tape measure. I like burring a foot, which all that means is you just line up the foot mark on your intersection, and then you have someone holds it like that on your first intersection, and then you pull diagonally, and then you can check your diagonal measurements. I like burring the foot because I've just found that it's more accurate. A lot of different people have a lot of different ways of reading tape measures. It's kind of a weird thing, but with the burring the foot, it's very specific. I even go as specific, because I'm kind of nitpicky. I go as specific as making sure all my guys go bottom of numbers or top of numbers. So that way the person on end A and end B have the tape measure where the bottom of the tape measure is on the intersection. Both people are doing it that way. So it's not even skewed by that tiny little bit. Again, is that really going to affect things? Probably not, but I just like to be as specific as possible because, again, why not? And particularly when you get the metal tape measures, the 100-foots, they have hooks on the end of them. And so you never know, if, especially again, if you have a newer guy, if they're kind of holding you on the end of that hook, if they're trying to hook the concrete, if they're not, what they're doing. So I do everything by burring a foot. And then, yeah, so if the diagonals line up from all the corners, then you're good to go. Most of the time they don't right away. And then it just depends on what the exact numbers are. Will determine kind of how you adjust it, but you do whatever adjusting you need to do based off to make sure everything's square. Then you recheck all of your distance measurements, and that's kind of where I base everything off of now, right? So I know my overall perimeter is exactly what I want it to be. I've got my 40 on all sides, and I'm perfectly square. And then I'll go into doing layout on my base spacings, and then I like doing layout on my openings too. I just kind of like doing things in stages like that. You don't have to do it that way, but I would at least do your base spacings right away, just because I don't know. It just seems to be the most efficient way to go about it. Because then the next step is kind of you're breaking down the material more. If I have space on a project while we're doing an inventory check, we'll try and preemptively stage stuff to some degree, or at least get things really, really well organized. So that way we already can show up and we can just start grabbing columns depending on the complexity of the building. That can be really, really quick and easy. You might have just like, okay, here are the end wall columns. Here's all our center ones. Center ones are typically doubles, end walls are typically singles. But again, it can depend. You could have singles all the way around. And then you just look out for different bolt patterns. If just some have apex braces and knee braces, some might have one of the two, some might have neither. It just really depends. But you organize, get everything where you need to be. And then I start prepping columns and get everything ready for standing. And I prep columns and girts and eave struts all at the same time.
Hey everyone, we were having such a great time talking with Nathan Margosian. We ran out of time, so we're going to roll over some of this conversation into another episode. Be sure to join us next time for more of our conversation with Nathan Margosian from Natmar Construction about erecting cold form buildings. This is John Cosper and Lauren Toole for Cold Form Buildings Made Easy.